All right, so you wanted to go deeper on unit testing.
Yeah.
And honestly, after going through all the research, um, it's actually way more interesting than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
It's not just about like, finding bugs. It's
It,
about making sure that like all the software that we rely on every single day
Mhm.
is built on, a solid foundation.
Yeah, and it's kind of like quality control at the most fundamental level.
Hmm.
So we're talking about examining the smallest pieces of code, like individual functions or modules,
Hmm.
and making sure that they work exactly as intended before they're integrated into the larger system.
It was kind of like spool.
Yeah.
Making sure each ingredient in a recipe is perfect before you like mix them all together. I mean, you wouldn't want to end up with a cake that tastes like salt instead of sugar, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And just like with a recipe, catching errors early in the development process is crucial.
Right.
Fixing a bug during unit testing can be significantly cheaper
Right.
than trying to unravel a complex issue later on.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
In fact, one study found that companies using robust unit testing practices saw a 30% reduction in post-release bug fixes.
Wow.
So that translates to save time, save money, and a lot less frustration for everybody involved.
30%. That's huge. So it's not just about making sure that the software works, but it's also about making sure that it's built in a way that's efficient and cost effective as well.
Absolutely. And beyond the financial benefits, unit testing also leads to higher code quality overall.
Okay.
When developers write unit tests, they're forced to think through different scenarios and potential edge cases,
Hmm.
which results in cleaner, more maintainable code.
Yeah.
It's almost like a built-in code review process.
Makes sense, like a second pair of eyes on it.
Exactly. And well-written unit tests can actually serve as living documentation for the code.
Oh, interesting.
If you're ever trying to understand how a particular piece of code works, looking at the unit test can provide valuable insights.
Oh, cool.
It's like having a handy guide
Right.
that explains the intended behavior of each component.
Okay, so we've established that, unit testing is important for catching errors, saving money, improving code quality. But how does it actually work in practice? Do developers just like stare at their code
Yeah.
and try to like imagine all the ways it could go wrong?
Well, there's a bit more to it than that.
Okay.
While there are manual methods, the real power of unit testing lies in automation.
Gotcha.
Developers write specific code to test other code,
Okay.
creating what are essentially mini-programs that automatically check for errors
Uh-huh.
and ensure that each piece of code functions as expected.
So they're writing code to test their code.
It is.
That's pretty meta.
It is. And to streamline this process, developers use frameworks like JoUnit for Java or NoUnit for .NET,
Mm-hmm.
which provide tools for creating and running these tests automatically. Imagine an assembly line where each component is rigorously inspected before being assembled into the final product.
Right?
That's kind of what automated unit testing does for software.
Yeah. That's a really helpful way to visualize it. So if I'm ever working with developers, understanding this process can help me communicate better and ensure that they're following best practices.
Precisely. It empowers you to ask the right questions
Yeah.
and advocate for quality. In the projects that you're involved with,
Sure.
you don't need to be a coding expert to understand the value of a well-tested foundation.
Now, you mentioned manual and automated testing. Are those like the main approaches to unit testing? Or are there other like methods out there?
Yeah, you hit the main two approaches right on the head. Manual testing, as the name suggests, involves manually running through test cases
Mm.
and checking for expected outcomes.
Right.
It's a valid approach, but it can be quite time-consuming. And let's face it, a little tedious.
Yeah, so it's like
Little.
instead of using a mixer, you're like checking every single ingredient in that cake batter by hand.
Right.
So automated testing is probably the way to go.
Exactly. Automated testing is much more efficient and reliable. It's like having a tireless robot chef who follows the recipe perfectly every time, ensuring consistent results.
I like that analogy a lot better. But I'm curious, are there like different types of automated unit testing? I imagine it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
You're right about that. There are actually different approaches to automated testing.
Yeah.
Based on how much the tester knows
Yeah.
about the inner workings of the code. They
Okay.
have these cool names too, like black box, white box, and gray box testing.
Okay.
Black box testing treats the code like a mysterious box. You only know what goes in and what comes out, but not how it works internally.
Okay.
White box testing, on the other hand, gives you full visibility into the code,
Well-
allowing you to test specific internal mechanisms.
Okay.
Gray box testing falls somewhere in between, providing some insight into the code's inner workings, but not complete transparency.
So it's like having like different levels of access to the recipe. So black box is like only seeing the list of ingredients. White box is like having the full detailed instructions. And gray box is somewhere in between.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And within automated testing, there's another layer of techniques focused on code coverage.
Code coverage, does that mean making sure that like every single line of code is tested?
You're on the right track.
Okay.
It's about ensuring that your tests exercise as many parts of your code as possible to catch potential errors.
Okay.
And those techniques even have catchy names, like statement coverage, which checks if each line of code is executed, decision coverage, which looks at different paths the code can take, and finite state machine coverage, which, don't worry, we won't get into the technical details of. But it essentially means testing different states the software can be in.
So it's about making sure you're not just testing the happy path, but also all the weird and wonderful ways the code could be used.
Exactly. And speaking of thorough testing, it's another fascinating technique that lets developers test code that's not even finished yet. Mock objects.
Hold on, testing unfinished code. Now that sounds intriguing.
It is. Imagine being able to test the checkout process of a shopping app before the payment gateway is even set up. That's where mock objects come in.
Okay, now you've got my attention. I'm definitely ready to learn more about these mock objects.
Let's imagine you're building that shopping app
Hmm.
and you want to test the checkout function. You could create mock objects to simulate a user's cart payment processing and inventory updates, allowing you to test the checkout process without actually needing a real database or payment gateway.
So it's like a stand-in for the real deal, a way to test the functionality of the code, even if all the pieces aren't in place yet.
Exactly.
So mock objects, they're all about like isolating pieces of the code and
Yeah.
testing them independently, which I imagine helps to identify bugs early on.
Precisely. And that early detection can save a ton of time and headaches down the road.
Oh, for sure.
But even with all the benefits we've talked about, some people still have misconceptions about unit testing.
Like what? Like they think it takes too long, or that their code is just so good it doesn't need testing.
You're reading my mind. Those are definitely some common myths we hear.
Yeah.
But the reality is unit testing saves time and money in the long run by preventing those bigger, more complex bugs from cropping up later in the development process.
Right.
And let's be honest, no one writes perfect code.
True.
Everyone makes mistakes, even the most experienced developers.
Yeah, for sure. We're all human. So it sounds like unit testing is a bit like having a safety net for your code, catching those little errors before they turn into major problems.
It's a great way to think about it. It's about building a solid foundation for your software
Yeah.
and ensuring that each component is working as expected.
Okay, so I'm sold on unit testing for developers. But what about those of us who aren't, coding wizards? Why should we care about all this?
That's a great question. Even if you're not writing code yourself, understanding the fundamentals of unit testing can help you appreciate the importance of good software development practices.
So it's like even if you don't know how to build a house, you can still appreciate the importance of a strong foundation.
Exactly. Knowing a bit about unit testing empowers you to ask the right questions. When you're working with developers or evaluating software,
Yeah.
you can inquire about their testing practices, understand the level of rigor that's gone into building the software, and ultimately advocate for higher quality products.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about being an informed consumer. Even in the world of software, you don't need to be a mechanic to understand that a well-maintained car is going to be more reliable.
Precisely. Think of it as being a savvy digital citizen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to write the code yourself, but understanding the basics of unit testing gives you a better understanding of how software is built and what goes into making it reliable and robust.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into the world of unit testing. It's amazing to see all the thought and effort that goes into building the software we use every day.
It really is a fascinating field, and we've only just scratched the surface today.
I know, and I have to say, learning about these concepts has definitely given me a newfound appreciation for the complexity of software development.
It's a field that's constantly evolving, with new tools and techniques emerging all the time.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive into unit testing. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic definition to the different types and techniques, and even explored the concept of mock objects.
Hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of why unit testing is so crucial to building high-quality software.
Absolutely, and a huge thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Yeah?
We encourage you to keep exploring the world of software development and never stop asking questions.
Remember, even if you're not a developer, you can still appreciate the value of a well-tested foundation.
And on that note, we'll sign off for today. Until next time, keep those curiosity gears turning. It's funny. I used to think of software development as like this magical process where brilliant minds just like conjure up amazing apps and programs out of thin air.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that impression.
But after this deep dive into unit testing, I realize it's much more like a carefully constructed builder, with each piece meticulously tested and validated before the next one is added.
That's a fantastic way to put it. It's not about magic. It's about discipline, rigor, and a commitment to quality at every stage of the process.
And speaking of quality, I have a question that's been bouncing around in my head as we've been talking about all these different testing techniques. So we focused a lot on how unit testing makes sure that like the software functions correctly, which is obviously crucial. But I'm also kind of curious about the bigger picture. Like, what about testing for things like security vulnerabilities
Yeah,
or like potential biases in algorithms?
that's a really important point. While unit testing is primarily concerned with the functionality of individual units of code, there are other types of testing that address those broader concerns.
So it's like you need to make sure the car engine runs smoothly, but you also need to check the brakes, the airbags, all the other safety features.
Exactly. Security testing, for example, focuses on identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hackers, while performance testing ensures that the software can handle a large number of users or transactions without crashing.
Okay, and what about like those potential biases in algorithms that we hear so much about these days? Is there a way to like
Oh,
test for that?
that's a complex and evolving area, but there are definitely efforts underway to develop testing methodologies
Yeah.
that can help identify and mitigate biases in algorithms.
So it's like you need to make sure the software is not only functional, but also like fair and responsible.
Exactly. It's all about building software that not only meets our needs, but also aligns with our values.
It sounds like the world of software testing is much broader than I initially realized, with different layers of testing, addressing different aspects of like quality and responsibility.
It definitely is. And as software becomes increasingly integrated into our lives, the importance of comprehensive testing will only continue to grow.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into unit testing. I gotta say, this has been a fascinating journey, and I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for all the intricacies of software development.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
And a huge thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this adventure. We hope you've learned something new and are feeling inspired to explore the world of software with a more critical eye.
Remember, you don't need to be a developer to understand the importance of well-tested software.
And as always, keep asking questions, stay curious, and never stop learning. Until next time, happy coding. Or at least happy appreciating the code that makes our digital lives possible.